Warm welcome to Queen Mary, especially to those of you who are staff or students here. Warm welcome to the university, and to people who are staff and students here. You didn't come far, so I'll just say hello. This event is being sponsored by two centres that we have here, two research centres. First and foremost, it's being sponsored by the Centre for the Study of Global Security and Development, and that's an initiative mainly between the politics and the geography departments here. And it might sound like that's something which looks at things far away, but of course, you know, global is where you stand, that's where it starts, and issues about security and development are incredibly pertinent to the times we live in the UK. So it's not like the global is something out there. The other one is the Centre for Ethics and Politics, which is in the business school here. And the Centre for Ethics and Politics looks at the ethical and political dimensions of global business practices. And again, we can say that that kind of stuff is quite relevant to us in the UK, right? Let me just start by introducing our speakers. And I'll start with Devon Thomas. Devon Thomas is a long-time community leader and a committed Pan-Africanist, put that right, yeah? He's the head of Lambeth Enterprise, which offers business support and advice for the local community and for the development of the local community. And you've been in that place for about 25 years, right?
The centre's been there 25 years, and we started in 1978.
1978, right. Devon is one of the coordinators of the Black Heritage Group. He was involved in putting together the Brixton Uprising 81 30th anniversary retrospective last year. He's, I guess, what they would call a kind of modern day griot.
Yes.
Yes. And he's constantly helping to commemorate sites of struggles in the UK, struggles over and for black community. Stafford Scott here. Stafford is a community leader and a consultant on racial equality and community engagement. You might recognise him because he's been in the media quite a lot over the last period, especially from August onwards, especially in one of his roles as representing the Duggan family. He was co-founder of the Broadwater Farm Defence Campaign back in 1985, and he was a youth worker back then. And he's also one of the co-founders of the Tottenham Defence Campaign for 2011. So I guess that kind of bridging that time will speak to one of our questions about what's changed and what hasn't changed. He was asked by the Independent Police Complaints Commission last year to take part in a community reference group, but he stepped down for various reasons, which he might tell us about, but a fundamentally flawed process, in your opinion, right? I should say that Denise Ferreira da Silva, who's a professor here in ethics, she was going to come and speak to us as well. She's had a last-minute emergency, so she won't be able to make it today. Our man here, this is Mark Thompson. Mark Thompson's a spoken word poet and an educator. He's a founder of Cultural Chameleon Press, which advances the works of poets and performers by facilitating processes of workshop development, self-publishing and promotion. He's author of the book Mixed Messages, which was on the table a minute ago.
It was here.
Someone's nicked it. Liberated it.
Yes.
Marketing.
There's another one.
Magically.
He was also the winner in 2010 of Monologues, which is like an extreme spoken word competition, online competition. So that's Mark. And then finally, but by no means least, is Lee Lawrence. And Lee Lawrence has joined us at the last minute, but we're very glad that he has. Lee Lawrence is the son of Cherry Gross, who was shot by the police in '85, one of the things which precipitated some of the riots and insurrections in '85. So Lee, we're very glad that you could come in at the last moment, really appreciate it. And on behalf of the audience and Queen Mary, I just want to say that we're all really grateful that you guys are here to give your, not just your experiences and opinions, but also your intellectual contribution to understanding these really pressing issues. What the format, how we're going to proceed, is it's going to be kind of like it's going to be a discussion, okay? And there's a few questions which I've got lined up, which I'm going to ask one of our contributors to kick off with, and then the other contributors might kick in as they see fit, and also I'll make sure that I've got an eye to the audience so that the audience can contribute when you want to contribute. So what we're hoping is that it's going to be an engaging and enlightening conversation, so please think of it like that in your head. And also it's being recorded, and we'll put the proceedings on YouTube. Toilets are just there, by the way. Because people ask that sometimes. And then people, I never know if I'm supposed to say where the fire exits are as well, because you know people say that? I am.
If in doubt, follow the signs with the green signs with the little
exactly.
dancing cat.
Right. Good job, I've been working at university, not school. But anyway, let's kick off. And one of the first things that I thought I'd ask, and I've directed to Stafford to begin with, because the Metropolitan Police Service put out a review yesterday about the August riots. And I'd just like to kick off by asking Stafford what you think has changed, if anything, between August 2011 and now March 2012.
That's an interesting question, as I know later on you're going to ask if anything's changed between now and the 1980s, which is probably easier to measure. To be quite honest, and in a weird way, August put Tottenham back on the map. We've got all these interested parties now coming to Tottenham. You know, we had Ian Duncan Smith there the other day. We've had David Cameron. With apparently Boris sneaked in and sneaked out at some point in the day. And he even more surprising, the local MP David Lammy turns up there as well. So Tottenham's been put on the map in the most weird and perverse kind of way. Changes are, I think, that young people are starting to become slightly more politicised, slightly more aware of how it feels, or slightly more aware of what it is that's been impacting on them for such a long time. They're starting to put it into a context, starting to relate to a time that went before them, so they know that this isn't the first time this happening. So it's helping to bridge gaps between communities now, because we have that shared and common experience. But in general, we're getting lots of people who are coming to Tottenham. They're all doing all these projects, all these wonderful things. 40-odd million pounds is being spent regenerating Tottenham, but we have a clique as the council, often the police, the local MP, and nowadays the local college, that they come together, and what they're doing is they use those structures to try and control the masses, try and control the behaviours of people. And I have a real problem with what's going on, because there's very little engagement happening with those young people who felt that their lives were so blighted that they were involved in those scenes that we saw on the 6th of August, that we saw in those scenes that kicked off everywhere. But also, when you ask that question, what's changed, it depends what date in August you're asking. Because if you ask me a question on the 6th of August, things looked one way. on the 6th of August, there was still this notion in the air that some young man from Tottenham had taken up a gun and had shot after police officers and therefore had to be taken out. On the 6th of August, there was a community complaining at the way that the police treated the family of that young man. But today, we know that the police have apologised for failing to provide an adequate service, and the IPCC has apologised for putting out erroneous information that there's a shootout. And if you could read the report that came out this morning, the 4 days in August, even in there's an acknowledgement by the police that they could have and should have put into the media, put out to the world that there wasn't a shootout. So there was lots of opportunities to stop what happened from happening. And there's now a recognition that some agencies didn't perform to the levels that we should all be able to expect as tax-paying citizens of this country. Problem with all of that is we still got hundreds, if not thousands, of young kids who are inside paying the price for all of these institutions' mistakes. So one of the things that hasn't happened between August and now, I think, is that as a society, we haven't properly learned, we haven't properly understood, we haven't even properly tried to understand why this thing took place and whether or not there's steps we can take to ensure it doesn't happen again in the future.
Would anybody else like to?
I mean, I'm probably the elder here, given it's my 60th birthday last week. I've only celebrated 3 birthdays in my whole life, because I'm a bit like the Queen. I've got 2 birthdays, when I was born and when I was registered as being born in Jamaica. Things are not necessarily as bureaucratic as here. Time is a bit more slippery. And I was born in the middle of a hurricane, so I always say I'm the heir to Marcus Garvey's tradition. They said, look for me in the whirlwind, and then I appeared, see? But I came up here to the UK, and history is an important part of all this. I came with my mother in the middle 50s, and my uncles and my father had come up here. My uncles had come up here and fought in the war, in the Air Force. And in fact, they went home on the Windrush. They didn't come here in the Windrush. It was a troop ship that took people home, because the British authorities were as slippery then as they are today. If you'd fought in the war for one of the colonial or the empire, they refused to demob you here. You had to go home to your home territory, and they'd give you your demob money and a suit. And then you found that your country was in disarray, because the way the empire worked is we supplied basic materials here and they turned them into products and sold them back on the world market. So you had a global system from then. But it was shattered by the war, and if you wanted to make a living and support your family, you had to leave. So they quickly jumped back on the boat and came back, and established the community as we know it today. And they were activists before they came here. My father was a trade unionist. He helped set up the Railway Workers Trade Union in Jamaica. He was then, before then, my mum and dad met in the Garvey movement. And so I was used to, in the home I grew up in, to activism, to listen to political arguments and debate, and I'm to challenge the status quo. And as a young person growing up here, there was nothing laid on. You know, if you wanted somewhere to go, there was no youth clubs. If you want to listen to music, you had to build a sound system. Anything you wanted, you had to create it yourself. And I think the difference between then and now is that we're going back to some of those first basic principles, that we become accustomed to a certain level of public provision. That there's a youth club up there, the council provides, there's a community centre, there's connections workers, and all that's getting the chop. And I thank God for that, because we can become self-sustaining again. We become too used to being on the drip feed of public resources. Now, it was right we fought for it. My generation fought to get access to resources, fought against racism, institutional racism in allocation of jobs, be able to come to college. I was the first in my generation to go to college. I studied anthropology at Goldsmiths College in the late 60s, early 70s. And there was only 2 of us as black people there. And I was the first member of staff on the staff in Goldsmiths back in the middle 70s. And you had to fight some basic battles. And when 81 happened, Scarman refused to accept that institutional racism existed. He said it was our perception. And if one thing has changed, our struggles have made sure that's not acceptable. And that somehow this is our own fault, that we've got a chip on our shoulder, that we are somehow deficient or a deficit model of human life. Because that's been the story for the last 400 years. And this is the legacy of that. This has not come by accident. Europeans have a way of thinking that's been conditioned by this idea there's a hierarchy of humanity, and the Africans are at the bottom and the Europeans at the top. And people might consciously say, oh, we don't believe that, but subliminally that's still there. You couldn't be conditioned around it for 400 years. And it's only under pressure when you see it come out. And whether you're a policeman or a teacher or whatever, it's at those moments that you can appreciate it. And this is why Scarman couldn't name it at the time. And as the founder of the Defence Committee in Brixton, a group of us came together after the community had to enough. You had to challenge all those notions, and it took another 20 odd years until the Stephen Lawrence inquiry that the system agreed that our view was the correct one. And it's again, you had to drag them kicking and screaming, and to have a conflagration again in Tottenham, and being accused, your young people being accused of being feral children, all kinds of stuff, when we're the products of this society. All its values of materialism and stuff, and then somehow we've come, come here and just visited this ourselves. You blame the victim. So we have to make some systemic analysis and come up with the proper conclusions. My experience has taught me that yes, we're not in the situation we were in '81. We're in where I grew up in Brixton. Things were bad. You lived in one room. Our places were rotting down. There was no investment. The economy was very similar to now. There was no opportunity for young people. Youth unemployment was 70-80%. I was working, running a grassroots community organisation, trying to provide housing, employment and training for young people and help people set up in business. And because if you didn't have any chance. You couldn't go somewhere and find a job. You had to create your own. And we have to look to our own resources. The same way our parents fetched up here and had to establish churches and everything for themselves with very little resource. Some of them only had very minimal education. Now we've got our young people who've spent how many years at school. Many of them are now in institutions such as this. My granddaughter has just gone to Essex to do maths and applied maths. She got 5 A stars in her A-levels. She's third generation to grow up in Brixton. Nothing wrong with Brixton. If you get the right guidance and nurturing, you can achieve. And I'm pleased to be here with groups of young people. They stimulate me and make me feel that, boy, this is how I used to stay 40 years ago, But we got serious challenges. Just sitting here and thinking, getting this education is going to take me into life is a sad mistake. The challenges and the opportunities are not going to be here in the UK. UK and the West has had its halcyon days. It exploited us to get rich. Now our countries of origin are taking back their share of the pie. So it means Britain and these countries have to get poorer. Right? It can't stay that way. For Africa to get its proper share, for Latin America to get its proper share, right? These countries have to take less of the pie. And that started to happen. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we focus too much on materially what we have, when life is about spiritual and morality. And you can live a happy life about human relationships and how to make them quality and be honesty. And once we get onto that level, then we can build great societies. You don't need a lot of money to do that, and 10 mobiles and 15 flat screen TVs and all that stuff. That's not what life is about. So that's the difference, I think, between those early days of struggle for me, because we were battling issues to do with police. Now, youth club, when we started it in the early 60s in Brixton, first thing we did was start a thing called a help on arrest scheme, because we were continually in conflict on the street, because you were defined as the most rebellious section, and they didn't want you teaching the rest of the society to go and challenge the notions of the mainstream. So you're on your case all the time. And 40 years later, I chaired a Safer Neighbourhood panel in Brixton, and police don't do anything there unless the community approves it. And that's come through struggle. It's not because we've got nice policemen. And that's, in any democratic society, the people you pay to do services for you should answer to you. That's the bottom line. And when we were challenging or struggling for this in the 80s, this was outrageous. The idea that police should be accountable was, you were a Marxist, or you were some kind of whatever. Now it's a stepped notion. So it's about holding the society to its promises, that it's supposed to be democratic, that we are supposed to control its resources, and that people should have a reasonable opportunity to realise their potential. That's all I ask the society to do. And if you can't do that, then me, you're going to be in struggle.
I wonder, Lee, maybe could you say some words on how you see the situation now from back in '85, for example?
Okay, and for me, I was 11 years old at the time when my mum was shot, and I experienced that, you know, at that tender age. Before then, as a little boy, I think I wanted to be a policeman. I used to like watching all the police programs on telly, professionals and so on and so forth. But seeing that put a really sort of negative image in my mind. And there's mixed feelings about that, because as well as you had the police officer that actually committed the crime and shot my mother and didn't show any remorse at the time, you had a really nice police lady at the time who was consoling me and looking after me. So it was it was conflict, and I suppose that's a clear picture of what it really is. You know, there are good people and bad people in every organisation, and it's just about being accountable and being responsible. And when you do find those people or those policemen who are committing those crimes or not fulfilling their roles, then making sure you highlight them, they're prosecuted and just like anybody else. But because that doesn't happen, you seem to feel like they protect each other, so therefore it becomes them and us. I remember growing up, I suppose that was an isolated situation for me, but I remember growing up and having my own experiences with police and racism within the police, and how they would talk to you, call you monkey and all these things. And I was quite shocked at the time when it happened. And if I look at today and what happened in last year to what happened in 85, it's ironic that my mum passes away in the same year that this uprising happens. And when it happened, for me, I felt automatically like nothing's changed. That was my initial reaction to what happened. I felt that pain all over again. However, I went to the streets and I wanted to speak to some of the youths at the time and find out what it was for them. And I spoke to some college kids, some boys that were young men that was going to university, some guys who were working, and I said, why are you out here? Because the way it seemed and what you saw from the media, it seemed like it was just thugs, gangs that was out here looking for opportunities. And you know, some of these young men were basically expressing that they're just fed up of being suppressed. They're fed up of the country, the government, you know, the police harassment, and that was just their time to rebel. And it was as simple as that. And so when you look at it from that aspect, not a lot, things have changed. We can't sit here and say they haven't. Things have changed, but not enough. Not enough has been done. And probably there isn't a big difference between 81 riots and 85 riots in the sense of the time. Right? So it's taken longer for another uprising to happen, but we saw at the time how bad it got and how it spread this time, and how many different communities all over the place feel exactly the same way. Now that's something that we have to address, and we have to realize, and we have to look at and try to understand. This just can't be, you know, rebellious youths out on the road just wanting to cause trouble. There's a clear issue here that I think needs to be addressed, and until we address that issue, it will happen again. That's my opinion on the situation.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on this?
We sort of started off talking about, I know you started off talking about just what had changed in the last, not even 12 months, since, you know, 7 months since the events kicked off in Tottenham and then spread across the entire country. And I think quite a lot has changed. I think there were a lot of people who were very angry and really weren't quite sure what exactly it was specifically they were angry about. When we talk about there being a period of politicisation, certainly as a member of a sort of artistic community, I think there's a lot of people that have started making connections between things and making connections back to historical events that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise have connected. As soon as you get the word riot, which is a word that we hadn't really heard a lot about for 20 odd years, people started to think, okay, this has happened before. Why did it happen before? and why is it happening now? And although I think a lot of what Devon said about the consumerization of our society did play a big, there's a big factor of people thinking, well, okay, there's an opportunity to get stuff. That's also a symptom of sort of deeper problems that exist within our society, which may not be to do with ethnic origin, but they're still serious problems. And in terms of institutionalized racism, one of the stories, I do a lot of workshops in schools about all sorts of subjects, but culture and identity being one of them, and we're talking about the effect of profiling. Now, profiling is something that happens within any role where you're constantly looking for a particular kind of issue. And I have a very good friend who I've known for 15 or 20 years, with two Jamaican parents, brought up in the West Midlands, who works for the Home Office, and she used to be an immigration officer. And she used to work at Heathrow. And after a certain period of working at Heathrow, I was having these conversations with her on a regular basis about the people she was dealing with, and she started to talk about Jamaicans and those Jamaicans and the Jamaican flights, and I'm sitting here thinking,
whoa, where are you coming from?
You've got two Jamaican parents. So it's not always about the colour of an individual's skin, it's to do with their experience. When I'm explaining, one of the pieces that I was talking about sharing today is a piece called Ghetto Label Wearer, and it's about trying to get young people to think about what message they are projecting. I'm dressed up for Ofsted, I've been in a school today. This is not necessarily how I would present myself on a regular basis, but I think a lot of our young people do dress in a way that identifies them and labels them. To their friends, it labels them as somebody who knows what cool clothes are and who knows different, about fashion and current trends. But to a police officer, it associates them with other people wearing those clothes that they have met on a regular basis. And unfortunately, they're not necessarily aware of how it is they're labelling themselves. So I try to get people to be aware of the issues of profiling and the fact that this is an ongoing issue. And whilst with the majority of our organisations, like education and like the police, are also dominated by white faces, that's going to be reinforced because the people that they work with are not from those communities. And if you work I live in South London, I've spent my entire life there, and if you're a police officer working in the way that you interact with young black men, the only young black men you probably get to see on a regular basis are the people that are committing crimes, and it warps people's interpretation of the people that they're dealing with. So it's not about necessarily, when we're talking about institutionalized racism, I don't think we're talking about good and bad people. When we talk about people getting shot, that's a different, we go to a whole new level. And there's no doubt that it's reinforced by some of these things that are going on underneath. But the institutionalized racism comes from the fact that they are repeatedly seeing the same things and getting a very narrow view. And the longer they spend in some of these jobs, the more narrow their view of these people might become, because the time when they were at school, maybe when they had black friends and when they were more likely to be around black people, gets more and more distant, and they're more and more likely to have a warped perception of the people that they meet.
Just a quick observation. Lee drew reference to the kind of coincidence of what was happening last year and the passing of his mother. It's also coincided with the verdict in the Lawrence case. Lawrence has been our high watermark in terms of expression of resistance to all this stuff, and it's the combination of all our struggles come together in a certain place, and the fact that we're able to challenge the criminal justice system and the whole way things work and take it in a total I think we need to acknowledge this and say, yeah, but what it's taken for that particular family or themselves, for that campaign, people don't know what that the price that had been paid. I've had some involvement with that, and I've seen what that family and those people involved had to do. And if you want to change the circumstances we have, this is a very old society, very set in certain ways in terms of institutions that operate on certain assumptions. If you want to change those things, if you want to change the notions in these places about what's accepted academic nostrums, struggle. serious struggle. And having a kind of nice, light-hearted thing where you skip through life ain't going to achieve that. All right? Mrs. Lawrence came out yesterday and said, listen, there's still things to do. There's evidence that it wasn't simply some mistakes made. There was systematic corruption going on. And everybody in South London knew about it. Nothing was done. It's been covered up. And it's what's led to us having to wait 18 years for justice. And you have to clean your stables.
Partial justice.
Yeah. Right? It's why half of those people escaped and not had to face justice. And that has to be accounted for. Right? And that refusal to accept second best and coupling together sort of some kind of compromise is not good enough. And it's getting young people to understand that and what has to happen. In situations, you've seen your tuition fees go up through the roof. You've seen people who are at FE having to give up educational maintenance allowance. All these things have moved this generation into motion. So it wasn't just what happened on the street last September, but it's moving across a broad front. And the attack on living standards of ordinary folk is being really hammered. So if you can't move to challenge that, when are you going to move? Yeah.
I'm going to see in a minute if there's anybody in the audience who wants to raise some points, questions, or comments. But just before we do, I was just going to ask Stafford something. At this, you were there, Devon, at that LMA conference, the Humpty conference, right? And there was a youth conference which was
alongside
parallel,
it, yeah.
Right? And one of the things which they reported back was that that a lot of the young people's perceptions of the police and of criminal justice, and the way in which they were interpreting what was going on in August, was at least partially, or actually significantly, filtered through what they'd heard their parents or uncles, aunties, grandparents talk about in terms of their stories about police and racism and violence and all that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering if you catch any of that in terms of how you see the differences or the similarities between now, between last year, 2011, and say 1985 in Broadwater Farm.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that young people said that their experiences reaffirm the experiences of their parents and those before them. This is an intergenerational thing. One of my concerns about a lot of the analysis about what happened in August is that race often gets left off of the agenda. That everything's conflated, so people look at Tottenham and at Salford and everything in between at the same time, and so everything then gets deracialized. And I think that in Tottenham, certainly what young people are saying, and what the community in general is saying, is there hasn't been enough changes since the 80s. And we've seen the stats. I think one of the most amazing things was when everything kicked off, we had everyone saying, well, everything's changed since the 80s. You can't blame all of the things that they blamed in the 80s. But since then, all the stats are telling us, actually, where there's been changes since the 80s, they're actually worse. So young people are now, right, and at the time they were peddling this mythology that young black males were 4 to 5 times more likely to be stopped than white males. But now that they've brought in the whole stats based under the Section 60 stops, we see that young black males were 28 more times likely to be stopped than white males. In Haringey, which is the borough that Tottenham's in, and we've got some really leafy parts of Haringey, Muswell Hill and Crouch End, where I doubt many stops and search take place. In Haringey, in the 2 months prior to the riots, in the 2 months prior to those riots, there were 6,700 stop and searches carried out. 6,700. And if you do the maths, it's the same kids
getting stopped all the time.
Getting stopped over and over and again. And this is about police officers stereotyping these kids. And I got to turn to Mark, because you said something there that I didn't quite understand. It was almost as if you're saying that the experience of people when they go into institutions then creates institutional racism. Institutional racism is created by racists. And it's just developed and built into their processes. And part of the issues that we're going through now, part of the issues that we're facing now, in the 80s we were very clear about racism. And white people were very clear about racism. That's why they didn't used to want to talk about it. Now, because we have this definition of institutional racism, some white people think, okay, so it's not about me no more, guys. It's not about me no more. It's all about those institutions. And one of the problems is that because of this attitude, we're not changing what is going on in those institutions. Nothing's changed. The stats around young people being excluded from school, they're just the same, if not higher, than they were in the 80s. Stop and search, I've just already mentioned. Unemployment, I mean, we've heard the stats yesterday. Yeah? 50% unemployment running among some of our young people. And if you come onto some of the estates in some of those boroughs where they're unemployment black spots, then unemployment is much, much, much higher. So I've forgotten the question now. at least I admit. Yeah. So you're supposed to give me a prod there.
Intergenerational.
Yeah.
Right. So the experiences are really intergenerational. I think when people are so shocked, what they need to understand is when you're reaffirming something, it doesn't have to happen every single day. It just has to happen a couple times because you're already prone to understanding its existence, and you're already going to respond to things differently. And I want to say I did use the term riots, and why I say riots is because that's what I saw. I was there and I saw that, and that's what was. That was what was different from the 80s.
Yes,
was the level of anger that young people directed specifically at the police in the 80s. Whereas this time round, the anger that young people are feeling is a wider society. Right? It's a wider society because wider society has just cast them off, marginalised them, isolated them. And the thing about consumerism, is they believe that they haven't got the capacity, they haven't been allowed to get the capacity, they haven't been encouraged and supported to develop the capacity to get the things that other people take for granted. So on that night, they went off on a spree. But personally, Broadwater Farm, we didn't loot. So Broadwater Farm for me was an uprising. What I saw, and especially when they start burning down shops and such, that was a riot. But it also shows the state of mind that our young people are in at the moment. There's a real lack of leadership within our community that wasn't the case in the 80s. In the 80s we had infrastructure. This time round we don't have it.
A quick observation. We've got the Olympics happening this year. I remember the message that came out when they announced that the UK had won this bid, London won this bid, that the multicultural society was going to express itself. Now, in what I do, I made sure I've been at the table when they're allocating resources. Billions have been spent. They said they're overspending by about 2 billion, so 12 billion. And the amount of that that's accrued to the let's say, minority communities has been minuscule. Right, in the name of multiculturalism. They're trying to get young black kids to act as volunteers when they've hoovered up all the money. Okay? As somebody who tries to put consortia together to bid for contracts to build an Olympic stadium, to offer all kinds of stuff, not one of the people I've worked with got any of that contract. So that's money that hasn't gone towards these young people who live in these communities who could have been all kinds of tradesmen and so on. So they remain hanging about doing the dysfunctional things that you do when you're on the margin, right? So if this additional spending of 12 million couldn't make an impact on that, what's going to make the impact? And if on top of that you're cutting back the social infrastructure that used to be there, what is going to be there for them? You're setting up, you're piling up like Mr. Powell used to say, a pyre, right? It's like you wish to conflagrate the society because you're not addressing the issues as to how people are going to become something in life because you're not investing in them. Okay, and if people like me who are trying to do it and you kind of not even allow me to go, how are they going to get access to this?
But the fact of the matter is that investment, so in places, again in Tottenham, they're going to spend £46 million regenerating the place. And they're not going to involve those marginalised people that I spoke about before.
The big companies.
This £46 million, had they invested a fraction of that in supporting and empowering and giving them some youth services and giving them some proper training, If they'd invested a fraction of that, we wouldn't have the issues that we have out there. So money's created out there within the system, but it's really not getting into the most impoverished communities, which means that the gap between those who have and the gap between those who have not is ever widening.
So coming back on to some of the other comments that we've had, I mean, in Brixton, there was, in 81, property was certainly taken and property was certainly damaged, but people were still knew that actually while they were in the middle of doing that, the people that they were really angry at were the police in a very, I think in a very specific and a very visceral way, in the way that probably when you saw young people being interviewed, although we all know that the media put up the things that they found most entertaining, so those kids were saying, oh yeah, I'm getting my taxis back, then you know that was going to get aired lots and lots of times because that made good television, rather than it being actually what motivated a large number of people. In terms of the institutionalised racism, I totally agree that particularly if you went back, there were huge numbers of overt racists within the police. The idea that you would, these days, in a public place, be called a monkey by a police officer, I think that probably has changed.
No, not that.
Depends
where you are.
I would say certainly the frequency of that happening has got to have changed. Whether there might be, what I was trying to suggest was that once patterns of behaviour that come from the fact that we were dealing with very, overt racism was considered to be kind of acceptable within these institutions. The people that were working alongside them, who perhaps certainly didn't go into the situation as overt racists, if you were to analyse their actions, would be clearly racist. Their actions would be racist. If you were to analyse the stop and searches, I'm not going to talk about the fact that some of these police officers would from today would stand and say, well, some of my best mates are, because that doesn't explain or excuse, but it is true. It is definitely true in a way that perhaps to a much greater extent than it would have been in 1981. That they are not the sort of people who would immediately judge a person simply on the colour of their skin. It would be, and when I started talking about profiling, that it goes beyond that and it becomes a culture, and that's why it's directed so much at the youth rather than necessarily at the elders, because they're looking at a particular image portrayed by young people, and whether they're involved in criminal activity or not, they're immediately tarred by being part of that group. And as a young person who was into hip hop, I was into sort of wearing clothes that I would have been profiled in the same way in the 90s. But we find ourselves 20 years on, and the young people don't even realise that they're being looked at in that way, and they're not even aware of those things. So that's one of the things that I like to raise to make sure people know.
My friend, my son can't drop his trousers and show off his bum on the street. He can't wear baggy trousers, he can't tattoo his body, and he can't put mark all over himself. He gets stopped and searched. Okay? It's not just about young people who look a certain way, it's not about that at all. And the reality is this, okay? Look at the stats. Let's look at the Met, look at any institution, and see how many times you see people within those institutions saying, actually, I saw my colleague behaving in a racist manner, and my colleague really shouldn't be allowed on the street. It doesn't happen. So it doesn't matter if there's 4 or 4,000 racists in there, because if the 4 carry out racist acts in front of the other 3,694, they're not dobbing them in. Okay? That's institutional racism, to the point where it's almost institutionalized. I'm not saying every officer is a racist, but the fact is, if he sees a racist behaving like a racist, he's not saying nothing. So he might as well be a racist, as far as I'm concerned. I am not. I tell my child not to dress certain ways because I want my child to grow up with respect for himself. But I'm not telling my child not to dress that way because that way may encourage police officers to harass them. As long as my child is not breaking the law, my child should be free and safe to walk the streets.
Absolutely.
Right? And we may say, okay, they're not doing as much as this, that, and the other as they used to do. They're shooting us instead now.
Exactly.
Okay? They're shooting us instead now. So personally, I come from a place called Tottenham. We don't ramp in Tottenham, We've lost too many people to be dealing with, trying to deal with political niceties. What we want is real debate and real discussion that's going to take us to another place. What we saw from this report that they put out yesterday was a missed opportunity to have those kind of discussions. Because what they did, just like I see the IPCC doing, what these institutions do is they hide behind their good office and then they tell the world their story from their perspective. That's not necessarily the truth, and it's not necessarily a reality. And that's part of the problem that causes problems in communities like mine.
I'll ask a question. I mean, last year I participated, 30 years after 81, they were doing loads of programs in the media about how far, this is before the conflagration in August, how far had we come and all this stuff. And I remember doing a program with an ex-police officer who served in Brixton, and he talked about how he'd been systematically turned into a racist, how he'd go out with his colleagues and they'd rouse people out, call them names. And he said he had to leave the police force in order to conserve his sanity and his humanity. He said that, and I remember being in a radio, because we did both TV and radio. They seemed to think we were a good combination, ex-radical and ex-policeman and all this stuff. And he shared parts of his experience about being in the Metropolitan Police that nobody else had said on the national media. And it shocked me, because I'd never heard any white policemen admit some of the stuff that had gone on, right? And it's a bit like hearing all this stuff that's gone on in the news of the world and people bribing people, all this stuff. There's this myth that we live quite honest lives and have honest institutions that don't lie, don't cheat, don't bribe. And it's going on all the bloody time. It's just that they're much better at hiding it, and creating a positive image. So if we have this, we've got to fess up, we've got to get honest. And that's part of what started to happen. But then there's this kind of, Stafford was talking about, we then gloss it all up. We've got all these PR people who create these reports, and we've got to maintain our decorum and image. We need honesty, and once we've got that, we can start addressing the issues, and come up with a system that's much more fair and decent and honest.
Maybe we can go to the audience now. I wonder if anybody's got any comments they want to make or questions. Jen at the back.
Firstly, thanks for coming down tonight.
Could you just speak up, mate? Sorry, because it's quite quiet.
Thanks for coming down tonight. I think you may have answered my question already in touch, so I'd just like to get your thoughts.
Hold on.
Ubiquitous man.
Hello. Hi. So while watching last year's events, they seemed pretty particular in that they were directed at their own communities, and I was wondering if, as you say, things have changed since the 1980s and the aggression was directed at society as a whole, was being alienated and institutionalised racism. And this is my point about what's being covered on the media. If it did happen, could you give us some examples? I mean, why didn't young people, rioters, go to Belgravia or Notting Hill or smash up, as you said, leafy places? And you said yourself it's what the media show you. So if that was the case, then were there ever any other instances of this happening?
I think no, the sisters said they would answer them.
Switch.
Hello. Right. Hi. So you wanted to know why the rioters were not in leafy areas of London? The simple answer is because they couldn't get to it. They were very well protected. I'll tell you, I was out in Brixton with my friend, and the police officers were standing on the corner having fags. They weren't doing a thing. So that is why they were able to destroy those areas. That is why they were able to attack those areas. If they'd have tried to step into the City of London, I'm telling you now,
They did.
They would have.
They did, and they stopped them.
They would not have been able to gain access to those areas. The areas that they did not want, they tried to get into Westfield, they tried to get into Lakeside, and they shut them down. They shut them down. That is why those areas were not smashed up. Realistically, they really wanted to go down to the House of Parliament and mash it down there, but they didn't get a chance. And I think, is that fair?
Is this related? Yeah. Well, just
I don't agree with you as much, and agree more so with you that I would like to say that I don't think it's to do with the fact that they couldn't get to where they wanted to go. I think that when people have an anger deep inside, they take it out on their own environment, and they reflect that in their own environment. So they're angry with the environment that they're in, and when it seems a bit trivial and it's kind of hard to comprehend, why would you mash up your own house? But when you're angry, say with your partner, don't you punch the walls in your house?
No.
But don't you mash up your own room when you're angry?
Well, but there may be another dimension to this.
Inside, don't you beat yourself up inside? And I think, to be honest, it's to do with inner transformation in the individual. So in order to help society, we have to change individually in a spiritual way, as the gentleman there said. We need to change in a spiritual way. So I do agree that you didn't understand why they took it out on their own area, but my explanation is because their own area is a representation of their inner feeling.
I mean, just quickly, on regard to this thing about, it's a question of how you define my area. A lot of people who live in those communities don't own the shops, don't own the wealth. They only have to go and give their money to them. So, you want a pair of Nikes, you've got to go down to Foot Locker and pay the money. But Foot Locker don't reinvest any money in that community. And this question about how people feel ownership for an area is critical. We've worked on this a great deal in Brixton. And I was very much involved in formulating the regeneration plans, and local people had to be on the boards of it and so on. And so over time, people have started to experience a different kind of relationship with their area, and they were out on the street. The reason why Brixton got away relatively unscathed, apart from Foot Locker, was that I chaired a business forum. A lot of my colleagues owned the businesses, and we were out on the street. We were dealing with youths for the whole week. I was sleeping on the street. I was holding 40 in one of the bars on Cold Harbour Lane. So you want to come on my shop, you have to deal with me. And I know your mother, I know your uncle. And when you're responsible and own your neighbourhood like that, it's a different thing to when you've got a corporate name sitting there with all the goodies in the window that I can't have because you haven't given the means to acquire it. All right? So there's an ambivalent relationship with that. They've dealt with that from America when they talked about internalized violence of the ghetto. They've been burning down ghettos in America since the 40s because people who live in there don't own their own community. And we don't elect our own politicians. We don't have a power over those environments. And when we do, the relationship with it changes.
And that's why when they're spending this regeneration money in places like Tottenham at the moment and not really engaging with the community as to how the money should be spent, when they build this thing up again, the people feel no ownership from. It's likely to go again. It's likely to go again. But I also want to re-emphasise, because this is what I meant before about everything just being conflated in one. In Tottenham, why Tottenham burned was because a young man called Mark Duggan was shot on the street. And when people went to the police station to protest and to seek answers, they wasn't given them. And in Tottenham, why they did what they did in the part of Tottenham where they did it was because the police officers were busy protecting Tottenham police station. Right? So they were left. Tottenham was left for them to do that. And if people can't understand, if people think that some youth gets shot on the street in Tottenham and you go to Bayswater to put in a demonstration, then I'm afraid you're not really understanding the emotional state that powerless people get into when they see what they consider to be the greatest kind of injustice carried out in front of them. And when they then see the members of their community that they cherish and who they know to be in pain disrespected in a very public manner, people are going to turn up at the local police station. Is what we do in Tottenham all the time. Cynthia Jarrett got killed, we went to the police station. Joy Gardner got killed, we went to the police station. Roger Sylvester got killed, we went to the police station. Mark Duggan gets killed, we go to the police station. It's the place where we go to demand answers, and those who are there should be sensitive and aware enough to know how to deal with people when they turn up on such occasion to ensure that those kind of things don't happen. This wasn't a planned thing. It wasn't something that people really wanted. And my friend taught me this thing about amygdala hijacks, when the emotional side of your brain takes over the logical thinking side of your brain. And when everybody came down from that hijacking, when everybody were more emotionally stable, of course people were gutted to see the services that they use and that their parents use and that their grandparents use burnt to the ground. But they felt, and they still feel, that they had no other choice but to make a real statement that really said to the world, wake up and look at what's happening to us, look at our experience and understand that this thing is too much for us to bear. Too much for us to bear and too much for one community to bear. And yeah, I'm gutted, embarrassed, ashamed that people from Tottenham turned other people from Tottenham into victims. But this is what happens when people have this sensation of powerlessness, and it's something as a society we need to better understand and address.
Can I ask if any people here were part in their areas subject to the right situation and saw shops, other places going up in flames, people looting, anything like that? Yeah. I mean, what did you feel about it? How did you experience it? Did you feel excitement? Did you want to go and join in? Did you feel fear? What was your emotions?
Microphone's coming.
Is it on? Okay, great. The area that I was in is Brixton, and for me and one of my closest friends, it was actually something that was a long time coming. Going on something Devon Thomas said about deracialization, I have a real problem, and the media has been doing this for the last couple of years with the amalgamation of the youth culture, and that's become a real problem. They don't address racialization, they don't address races, they don't address people individually. They've amalgamated them all to one. So when you talk about youth culture, it's automatically attributed to something bad. Okay? Now these emotions have been stirring to a lot of young people, and people are talking about the youths, but actually the majority of people that were arrested were actually adults, which is over 18. And this is another thing that I think people talk about the youth and the youth and the youth. So that's something that also has to be addressed. The problem is infrastructure. And what this guy was saying is we need to look into ourselves. That's all well and good, but if we're in a society where the infrastructure is broken, you can't do things like that. Where there's no leadership in government, where obviously you're seeing expenses, bankers, there's no responsibility at the top. How do they expect responsibility to be at the bottom? There's no in family structure. Well, there's been broken down family structure. A lot of it's attributed to, they can go into all of that, but a lot of that is money as well, politics as well. How can you afford as a mother to stay at home with your child where you've got to work 2 jobs? And those are the things that were not being addressed. So for me, it was a long time coming, and it will continue to happen until those issues are addressed.
I mean, I asked the question about experience because I remember in 81, we'd had lots of community skirmishes before. In 73, there was a thing at the fair when there was a fight and 3 guys got arrested in one of the first campaigns around the Brockwell 3, 76 at the carnival, and that was pretty major. But 81, round the corner from my house, I lived in the dead centre of Brixton. A conflict happened, guy got stabbed, police took the guy in a car, and they'd been harassing, stopping and searching the whole community for some weeks before. And it was like a tinderbox. And I stood and watched it happen. I stood and watched. The police were upset because their authority had been challenged, and they tried to hit at people, and the whole community came at them in force. Picked up a car, threw it on the roof and lit it, and it went up from there. And you sit and you watch the neighbourhood, the streets you walk past every day. I used to take my children to school across Rowton Road, and you watch it going up in flames. And your emotions are very, very double-edged, because there's a kind of carnival atmosphere at the same time. There's all kind of things going on at the same time. And I'm not kind of, I'm a person who's always been in a leadership position in the sense that I was running organisations. We set up the defence committee, we opened up the law centre, and we were providing solace and defence for people. So a lot of time in those kind of upheavals, it's not the people who throw a brick or throw a bomb who get grabbed. It's people standing about who the police can get to. So there was 500 people who were in jail at the end of 3 days in Brixton 81, and you had to get them lawyers, you had to get them doctors. We made a thing called the People's Account, which we did for the 30th anniversary. We interviewed people, like the first guy who was arrested on Rowton Road in 81. And if you listen to his testimony, he said, I had all kinds of people, journalists come, and they never print or they never show what I experienced. How it sounded like a dungeon in South Africa during the highest point in apartheid, how people were being beaten and kicked all night, and we were singing The Rivers of Babylon at the top of our voice to drown out our screams, right? And he, 30 years after, he was crying tears through what the trauma he experienced at the time, right? And they've never represented that on the media as to what happened, right? They've never taken into account those things. And we had to make that story. And you have to write your own history if you want to get it out there, that says. And you know, this is not an easy thing. It's like we're in a war zone, you know, there's casualties, there's people who are getting taken out. And it was interesting walking down the street with this policeman, because at that 30 years ago, he was over there and I was here, you know, and he could have got a brick. I don't know. But we were able to stand together and talk and share experience. And we're all human beings, and this society is only going to work when we can start having that debate and dialogue. He's not going to be my friend, but we're fellow citizens here, and it's not going to work. I've got my grandchildren, going to have great-grandchildren soon, and it has to work. And because if it don't, their lives are in danger.
Can I just step in a minute? Mark, I know, Mark, you wanted to say something. Lee, did you want to say anything as well? Maybe if Mark... Yeah, and then we've got a couple of people who want to speak as well, so kind of,
where I live in southeast London, it was nothing like Tottenham, you know, in terms of what was going on. There was a big, there was a huge number of people gathered at Lewisham at one point. But one of the, you know, in terms of where people went and how much effort it took to stop them, I think one of the best stories, there was Foot Locker in Catford got wrecked, and that was all over YouTube and whatever. But there was another, there's another small retail part. The closest thing to me that actually got damaged is probably a 4-minute walk from my house. Except that 2 police officers managed to turn back this mob of young people. And in terms of whether or not, you know, how hard it was to direct this if somebody actually put some effort in, you know, to protecting property, which is one of the things people seem to be so worried about. I mean, I'm more worried about the people's, you know, there were people's homes and things like that. But in terms of whether or not it could have been, you know, Tottenham could have been different if the police officers were less worried about the police station or more worried about property, if that was what they were genuinely worried about. It took 2 police officers to turn back this crowd from the Currys, Dixons and PC world. 2 police officers who actually decided they were going to try and stop something. But it makes me question why all those other, you know, when there were so many police in London, not necessarily on the first night, but on the successive nights, why, when there were so many police, why were so few places being actively protected? There has to be a reason. And to me, it seemed as though what was going on was that they were looking for excuses in order to be able to deal with things more heavy-handedly in the future. It seemed as though there was a deliberate policy of we'll stand back and we'll show people in this country how bad these people are, so that we can get baton rounds acceptable in this country, so that we can get water cannon acceptable in this country. So, you know, there was it felt as though it wasn't accidental that this damage that took place. It felt as though it was being pushed and manipulated into ways that was going to paint these young people in the worst possible light, in order to therefore allow for there to be changes to policy that previously people would have said were disgusting. I mean, Facebook and Twitter were very interesting. You got to find out a lot about, I mean, I've got a lot of people who are so-called friends because of poetry events and things, and suddenly you were finding out what was going on for some of these people underneath. And I worked in a lot of schools in Eltham and around the area that Stephen Lawrence died. I mean, I was doing youth work in that area only a couple of years after Stephen died, and suddenly, you know, you've got the EDL gathering to protect Eltham, but you hear the songs that they're singing, and you have to think, well, hold on, there is a serious undercurrent here, which is definitely overtly racist. And the bottom line is, they may not feel it, they may not feel comfortable or happy or like it's acceptable for them to say that in public on a regular basis. But in this situation, when things become polarised, suddenly it was okay for hundreds of EDL to march down Eltham High Street, saying all kinds of things about black people.
But the message I heard, they said they were going to Catford to sort out the blacks, and the police had to stop them.
They basically gathered in Eltham and they were going to head towards Lewisham, and there were all kinds of comments. And I have to say that they were actually prevented from marching towards Lewisham.
Well, they could afford that. It would have been conflagration.
Well, absolutely. I mean, but also the other thing that I really wanted to get across was that, and this is not about, it's not about deracializing for me. It's about seeing that racial incidents happen within a wider context. In terms of people feeling powerless, when we've had in this country millions of people march against the Iraq war, and this country goes to war regardless. When we've seen protests against all kinds of things, people are like, well, polite civil disobedience doesn't work. No one listens. So we're going to do something different. And if you're coming from Tottenham, you're coming from Brixton, and your family, and you're aware of a history of a different kind of struggle. When you're in that situation where you feel powerless, as you said, they don't ramp. Well, I understand exactly what you mean, which is that, in that situation, they're not going to sit back meekly and take it. They're not going to have just us they're not going to stand quietly outside the police station. They will demand answers, and if answers are not forthcoming, they will take alternative action. And their means may not be the ones we would like people to be taking, but what means can we offer them that will actually get the action that they want?
I agree with what you're saying. As much as I don't condone the looting and the burning down of houses, if the community hadn't stood up for what happened to my mum, people probably wouldn't even remember who she was or what happened to her today.
How many of them are there?
So I think it's important that we stand up for our rights. And with this last incident with the uprisings, I prefer to call it an uprising because that's how it started. There was a part of me that wanted to be out there on the front line as well, because I saw this as being an opportunity for me now to actually do what the community done for my family and stand up for something that was wrong. The situation was escalating in a way where I couldn't afford to put myself. I've got a son, I've got children. I've got to set an example, and I've got to fight the battle in a different way now that I'm older and wiser. But that feeling initially, I wanted to go out there myself because I could feel the injustice, and it hurts when you see your people going through these things unnecessarily. And today, up to today, we're still really no clearer about what exactly happened. Now, accountability is what's coming to mind, and they need to lead by example. They tell young men, if you're in a gang and something happens and you're not prepared to tell us who done it within the gang, you're all going down. You're all going to get the same sentence. But yet you're not prepared to do that in your own gang, right? You're not prepared to say, okay, there is a bad police officer. I had an experience once where my niece was arrested. I went to the police station to get her, and she was and then handcuffed her to her wrists were bleeding. So I was upset. So I went to the police officer. Why have you handcuffed a 16-year-old girl and to her hands were bleeding? So he headbutted me, right, at the time, and was screaming and shouting that my niece had spat on him. So he basically said, what would you do if someone had spat at you and he tried to headbutt me? We did headbutt me. So there was a black police officer in the station at the time. So I said to him, did you see that? He said, see what? The cameras were on in the police station. I said, all right, I want the camera. He said, they're not working. So therefore, straight away, what does that do? What does that do for me? I've already had my experiences as a child. Now, as an adult, coming to, protect my niece, I'm faced with this as well. So if they're always just going to cram together and say, well, you know, we're going to stick together whether we do good or whether we do bad, that's just the way it is, we're never going to bridge that gap between the community. All we want to see is that people are accountable, that you acknowledge when you have got bad seeds and you do something about it. We can accept nobody's perfect, but just take accountability for what happens within your force. And I think it's as simple as that. And until that happens, there's always going to be this frustration with how the system works, because it's not fair.
I know there's a couple of people who really wanted to be saying something for a long time.
Two things I wanted to say. Firstly, that I think it's really important to be specific. I always find it really annoying when people talk about the youth, because I'm young and I did not feel the need, that I didn't see any writing, I wasn't involved in it, so I don't like the blanket term that's always used. So I think it's important to be specific about, and then also I agree with what you're saying, to be specific about why people were writing, because there were different people involved, very different people, and they were writing for different reasons. But all of those reasons are valid, and they all need to be acknowledged. And so to just look at some reasons is wrong, and to ignore others. And the reasons that usually get ignored are to do with race, because people feel uncomfortable talking about that, which is an issue in itself. And then another thing which struck me was that I was disappointed, but also not surprised by the media reporting of the whole issue from the beginning, and not just the reporting but the commentators. I mean, David Starkey's comments were really shocking, but also not surprising as well. And I think that the media representation of us trying to vilify, and our politicians, you know, David Cameron said that it's just pure criminalisation, they should all be locked up. I think it's really simplistic to think that just because somebody isn't holding a placard, it's not political, because you don't always realise that you're being political, that the reasons why you're doing something are political. So I think that the political and the media reaction to what happened are just as much a reflection of an issue as the fact that there were riots, and that that was something that struck out for me.
There's a number of people, and maybe I just have a comment for
my pen ended up being covered by Devon. It was more to do with community.
Oh, okay. Helen, that's Rick.
Thanks. I hope you don't mind. My kind of question is slightly on a different tangent from where the discussion is, so I understand if you don't answer it.
Rick,
I can wait.
Take you in a minute?
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
Okay? I know it is my mate. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Just a reflection. The question before was at the beginning was about the change from now to about the 80s, and I think that definitely one of the changes, or maybe it feels like an increase, is the amount of violence, the serious violence within the black community. And I realise as community activists, you know, a lot of you guys have made some like this huge efforts in terms of like well-known issues. And I think Stafford, for example, something I saw on the television while I was away looking at the riots, was like, wow, there's just the way you was on television debating with somebody. I thought it was really impressive, fantastic. And then something that you said, and then I think you said as well about feeling that young people have been politicised since then a little bit. And I thought, wow, I haven't noticed that myself. But I work with young people. I work in Hackney, and we work with young offenders, etc. And I thought, wow, I really need to reflect on that. I haven't done that enough of that, talking with young people, because from then till now it's been the same old running around trying to catch people to just get them to stay in one place. I'm going to have to talk with them on a basic level. You know, people self-harming, hurting themselves, hurting other people. It's just the same old. every minute of the day, you know, working flat out, just trying to do whatever we can just to stop people just injuring each other and themselves. So, so I was reflecting. So that would make me reflect. God, I need to just somehow break through that and just be able to talk to people on a level like, how do they feel about the rights? But then I'm wondering, and again, it might be off on a tangent, but the point we heard about inner transformation and anger and taking it out in your local community, then like I'm just wondering if by the end of the discussion we might lead to some sort of solutions, or where you think from now to those young people who are in that place, where can, because the other 2 points that you said was, one of you said that you suggested that we don't need the youth clubs, we don't need those sort of...
No, you don't need them. You
Right.
need to have them in a different way.
I had them in a different way. So I'd be really interested to hear what it is, because obviously things have changed. There's more youth clubs and resources into the community for young people than there were before. And it's like, well, what do we do next? What do we really do from where we are now in terms of... And I'm more interested, to be honest, with stopping young people hurting each other right now than the other bit is going to take a bit longer. And do you see that happening first? Which way round is it? What do we need to do?
I think what we might do is actually take that question you just asked as one of the last questions, which we actually deal with.
Hi. My point follows on from the point that gentleman said. I'm a student here, and I also work in children's services in one of the London boroughs. And to be honest with you, I'm tired of the analysis of why did this happen, what did this happen. I know it's like 7:30 and the event goes until 8. I think we really need to talk about what we're going to do next, because there's lots of analysis, like even within my borough. We don't even call it riots, we call it summer disturbances. So like, for real, we really need to be talking about what we're going to be doing next.
Can I say, until you understand what is wrong, you can't start to you can't start to address it or seek to cure it. And a lot of that has happened. It's created a tick box exercise. We see millions of pounds being wasted by local government on that. If I can say, the thing about youth violence, and I appreciate not all youths are involved in violence, and from my days as being a youth worker, youths are between the age of 11 to 24. So it's actually older than 18. Now, youth violence, I mean, I could do a whole entire theory or workshop on how, because of how we responded to the racism that we faced in the 70s and 80s, we created front lines. And those were the places where all the riots took place eventually, on the front lines. And then the breaking down of the front lines, which was normally drug induced, so the drugs came into the community in one way or t'other, then led to the creation of ends, which then led to a sense that young people are in competition with each other. So, and this is me trying to take some responsibility for the situation and the place our young people are in. What we're going to do about that, I'm one of the organisers of the Tottenham Defence Campaign, and on the 4th of August, we're going to have at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre in Tottenham the inaugural Mark Duggan lecture, and we're going to be bringing over Joy DeGroy-Leary, who will be doing a whole entire workshop on post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And I'll tell you something, until you've heard, and obviously no one person comes with a solution, but until you've heard about the reality that is post-traumatic slavery syndrome, you haven't got a clue what the problems are. So we will be doing things to help young people to contextualise and understand where all the stuff in their life, where all these isms are actually coming from. And it's only when you understand, then you can start to look to develop and carry out some kind of healing process that takes you to a better space and place.
Do you mind if and then we'll come back.
Sorry, does that work? Yeah. All right. I agree with the last point completely, and I think probably one of the reasons why people are a bit worried about like constantly debating the subject is because actually people are living these lives on the ground, you know, like the boroughs are still there. And these debates seem to be happening a lot on, well, they were happening a lot on like Newsnight and stuff, with like no black faces, no young faces at all. And that's probably the reason why a lot of people were pissed off with it. I want to make 2 quick points, one of which was about asking about what has changed. I think one thing that clearly hasn't changed is the police still lie, you know, like they just get away with it. They make barefaced lies. You can see it with deaths in custody, you know. But they did it during Mark Duggan, they did it with John Charles de Menezes, and they'll continue to do it because they think they can get away with it. And it's just the barefaced lies that they give out that really kind of like inflame the situation. The second thing I wanted to say was kind of back to the first point about why people didn't riot in Chelsea. And I think it's a bit unfair to have a go at him. I can see what he was trying to say, but the point I want to make is that like being in Brixton on the night on the Sunday night was such a contrast to like about 6 months earlier when I was at student protest. Yeah, there were a lot of young people at student protest, a lot of young people pissed off with losing EMA and stuff, and like there were thousands of police there, and like the contradiction between that and what it was like on Brixton High Street that night was just immense. And the reason is because we were by Parliament, you know, we were by number 10. We weren't like in some area where most of the people in power don't care about, and that was a big difference. And I think that actually, like, you look at the places that got smashed up in Brixton, it was Foot Locker. You can see why it got smashed up. Like, they charge £110 for a pair of trainers, you know what I mean? Like, if they're in the windows, like, and you live your life trying to get those pair of trainers, like, the time where you've got an opportunity because the police are stepping back, you're going to go and do that. It's a rational thing to do. But that's kind of off the point. But yeah, police should stop lying is my main point.
I've got a couple more written.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, it links, I suppose, in terms of this question about space, or you know, in terms of the place of riots, in a sense of, and I suppose I wanted to kind of bring in the global, or the broaden it out a bit away from what's been happening in the UK, not belittling and what's been already said. I understand if you don't want to respond to it, and it was really just thinking about the way in which these issues are also playing out to varying degrees in other places in Europe. And one thinks of the riots that took place in Paris and other kind of French cities after the shooting of a young North African chap a few years ago, and the way in which that had a particular kind of spatial dimension in terms of the way in which the French cities, particularly in Paris, it's a white city, and immigrant ethnic populations are in the banlieues outside, and in some senses that, I suppose, plays out also in a kind of American context where you've got highly racialized spatial divisions within cities, and London in some senses has that as well. I mean, in South London, in Brixton, I mean, the gentrification and just the kind of the small pockets. But I think that's, I mean, to what extent is that a kind of an ingredient, a factor that plays out in terms of anger and resentment and the place of rioting? And the second point, I suppose, links into the debate about where we might go, and the student protest over EMA, the Occupy movement, the fact that there are these counter movements that are generating a new form of politics that are a response to the failure of politics, and obviously that I think all the speakers commented on that, the failure of the political class, the political system at national, at local level. These rights, obviously are deeply indicative of that. So to what extent these kind of movements, the Occupy movement, trade union movements, can kind of build some kind of politics from below, or at least to put pressure as a way of resolving these things, or at least getting resources into communities that can alleviate some of the underlying problems.
Thanks. Just got a couple more, and then maybe.
Hi. Basically got an observation and then a question. I think it's quite interesting that about the fact that the nature of the riots were quite gendered, and whether you could maybe talk about that, and whether the because obviously most of the perpetrators or the people who who've been arrested and been put on trial have been like young men, kind of what you think about that and why that is. And then secondly, I can't remember what your name is, but the poet was talking about the fact that the people who rioted didn't think that dialogue was going to be a way to solve the problems that they feel their communities have. So my question is, do you think that violence and rioting has actually kind of, has it done anything? And has it given them anything that they wanted, or has it solved any of the problems that caused it?
Thanks. Has anybody else got any burning questions? Okay, and then okay,
people seem to keep talking about the riots as if they were a movement. It was a reaction. So you cannot say that, violence, did it solve any problems? Because it wasn't planned. It was a reaction to what happened. It was something that spiraled, and it was an automatic response. So it cannot be. You can't see the riots as a voice to any of the problems that the communities had.
And then finally,
while the mic's travelling, I think in comparison to the number of other deaths at the hands of police officers in the last 20 years, Mark Duggan's name is certainly a lot better known than it would have been otherwise. So in terms of, did it achieve anything? Yes. Did it achieve everything? Obviously not.
I just wanted to say a couple of things, just for the... I don't know what you were just saying about the trade unions stepping in. I think, the people have stepped in. That's, for me, what happened with the riots. What happened was the people were stepping in. That's it. This is where we are. People have put up with injustice. They've said something. They've done something. And I'm so grateful to those people for doing that. I live really close to Tottenham. I'm quite involved in sort of local stuff. And it was just, fantastic the next day going round and seeing, obviously it's terrible, but it's also people, taking it into their own hands. I mean, I think that's where it's at. It's in the communities, and we have to take charge, the people, us.
So maybe if we just get some, okay, one more at the back there. And then we'll get some responses, and then we'll have a final consideration about what's best to be done, and then we might ask that question about art, what place art is in that. Yes.
Yeah, hi, £27 million has been allocated to Tottenham. 9 million local government, 18 million from the GLA. How do you think it should be spent? Because what we're seeing, it looks like it's going to go back to what happened in Brixton. Capital development, elements of gentrification, but really asking the people on the ground what's necessary, and speaking to people like Stafford and Stafford, etc., the people who know what's required, would appear that once again it's going to just be the big companies come in, do what they've got to do, and fly out. I need to find out what's going to happen, or at least ask the question, what do you think is going to happen?
Okay. Really quick? Okay, go for it.
I think you answered the question anyway. You said what's going to happen, and it's clearly happening there. I wanted to say one thing about did the riots achieve anything? I don't think that anybody who rioted actually expected to achieve anything. It was a kind of remote, emotional response to what was going on. And a riot is different from a civil war. A civil war you might expect to take over and change things. A riot is an immediate response and is a putting down of a marker that a milestone has been passed, that something has happened that was too terrible and that it couldn't go without some kind of community response.
Yes.
I just wanted to kick things off in terms of solutions and what solutions we think are going to solve some of the problems. I don't think there's going to be one solution, because there isn't just one problem in our communities. I think there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of responsibility, there's a lack of ownership when it comes to people talking about the youth. They're marginalised. There are children back home it takes a village to raise a child. When you see a child misbehaving out on the street, it's not for you to just walk past them and leave them to continue behaving. As an adult in the community, you are to take ownership of that child. So it's not just, okay, we're going to all go home and have another discussion. When you go out, you go and police your streets. You go and deal with the children on your street, because there are children, and that's where I'd like to kick off the discussion.
Solutions. New Year's Day last year, I'm a reflective kind of person, and many things have been happening in our community. And as time has gone on, one thinks about one's own mortality and wanting all the work one has done over a long period to actually mean something and leave a foundation. And one felt that there was an increasing gap between the generations and the dialogue. Transference of understanding, experience was not being, and I spent a lot of time around heritage. Chair of a thing called the Black Heritage Group. I've been helping to create the new National Heritage Centre in Brixton. All kind of practical things, and we need institutions. But we need a dialogue, a debate, a conversation in our communities, between the younger and the older, between the men and the women, between all kinds of sections. Because if you're going to deal with issues, practical issues, for example, like how is this money going to be spent in Tottenham, or how is it going to be spent in Brixton, you have to have an organised group, in the business sense, in all kinds of levels, to be able to challenge and channel that money. Because otherwise it goes down business as usual channels. That's what we learned. And to create that, you need out of the conversation becomes an agreed set of objectives, an agreed activity that leads to outcomes. Right? Simple as that. And it's going to come out in all sorts of different ways, because we need therapy, we need business organisations, we need people trained and educated, we need all kinds of things. And only we can do that. Somebody else can't come in and say, all right, go up to Lambeth College and you'll get it there somewhere. It has to start like when our parents got here, and when we went to school, they weren't being educated the way they wanted. They set up supplementary schools, right? And then Bernard Cool wrote a book that analysed it, and then we reacted to that, and a whole level of structure and organisation flowed. Us being sucked into the mainstream took us away from all that. We thought the problems had been solved. We've now got jobs in the system, so it means the problem. It didn't mean that at all. It just meant for a period there was affluence, and enough of us got jobs in the system, and all the people who were locked out, we could forget them for a while. Now, the last couple of years, all those people who found a place in the system got dashed out back. Half of the black staff form in Lewisham have been made redundant. So all these comfortable people who bought their houses out in the suburbs are finding their, doing gossip. All right? And we have to find our organising selves back again. That's what I'm saying. We have to go back to first principles and stop being dependent on the state delivering you something and organise it for yourself. Because when you do that, you own it. When the council provide it, when there's no budget for it, it shuts. And you haven't got experience of running it, organising it and resourcing it yourself. I'm a Garveyite. That's where I start. Unless I know where the money come from, how am I going to run it and just steal it, I ain't interested in it. Because that's somebody else's thing. Alright? That's our solution to the problem. Go, challenge each other, organise together and create the structures we need for the future. If you ain't doing that, go somewhere else and stop talk.
Well, I got nowhere else to go, you know that, bro. And
Well,
I hear what
move
you
to Hackney.
Fam, I hear what you were saying, and I've been hearing that for the last 20, 30, 40 years, to be quite honest. I'm not disrespecting it still. But hear what? When I work, I pay my tax. I should be entitled to expect what other people expect. I should be entitled to expect if I pay my tax, I get quality of education, that I get a quality of police service, that I can expect choice when I need to use the health service. So again, and I think some of our younger people, some of them are rejecting this notion of when we talk about our past, because we're in a situation right now, for example, where we call our young people African Caribbean, and we're not recognizing the actual fact that they're actually born here in Britain. So that makes some of us less relevant to young people as they're beginning to reject that, and we need to acknowledge where we're at. We should be, I mean, you said Bernard Cord wrote one book and it had such an impact. We should be writing and capturing the culture, the culture that we've created here today. Because I see every other community taking pieces of our culture. I see ads on TV about Wonga.com and they're all hamming it up and they're taking from our culture. So I think we need to recognise how powerful the culture that we've created here is as well. We need to acknowledge these things, and we need to hold those who provide services to us to account. I mean, we had some legislation in the Race Relations Amendment Act that, had it been properly carried out, undertaken by the public service, would have, without a doubt, improved the quality of services that came to our community, and we had a real opportunity to force that through. But I think that, again, because we're looking elsewhere, we didn't capture, we didn't use that.
But that's my point. We weren't organised.
And in not doing so, in not doing so, and I never use the term leader, so I'm not taking no blame. In not doing so, we didn't provide adequate leadership to some of our young people so that they would have opportunities that maybe wasn't around for us when we were their age.
Well, it's the movement that creates the leaders, you see. Once you're part of the movement, you have to have people that fulfil functions, that articulate on its behalf, that holds that leadership to account. We went into quiescence as far as movement was concerned. That's what I'm on about. And you have to start somewhere. In order to control what happens in the council, it's not just about having some black councillors, it's about having a movement that puts them there and holds them to account. It's pointless having a social wage unless you're influencing how it's spent and how it's actualised. So whether it's an independent organisation outside or inside it, that's what I'm on about.
Lee, have you got any thoughts about solutions?
I think it's a combination of the two, where it does start with us in a sense of taking responsibility for ourselves and our children and our community. For example, when it started to kick off in Brixton, my son was at the Brixton Splash.
Yeah.
And as soon as I started to get a whisper that things was going to take place, I got in my car, went down there, got my son, brought him home. And it was amazing that after a certain time, they sent out a message to say to the parents, make sure your children are at home. But before that, they wouldn't say that. They wouldn't say, and this is one of the issues, that they're not working with the parents. So there could be they call it a misdemeanor that happens on the road with a young adult, which you could contact the parent, speak to the parent, let the parent know that this is what's happened. You know, next time we're not going to be so lenient. Fair enough. We see that we're working together, there's a common goal, but it doesn't feel like there's a common goal. So I think we need to be clear about, do we really want to solve this problem, or are we just trying to control the problem? And I think once we're clear about that, then we can start working backwards and saying, oh, how are we going to solve this problem, and how are we really genuinely going to solve this problem together? For example, I come to Devon about certain things. He's a community man. He knows a lot about what happens in the community, and certain things I want to know, information I want to know, advice, I know I can go to him and get that advice. And it's only since my mum passed away that I even knew about Devon and his position within the community, that now I can use his resources to help me to do certain things I need to do. And we've established the relationship now, and he knows that, you know, I'm going to be tapping into his resources. But I just think that needs to be readily available. Before, as I said, I didn't know that it exists. So we need to make sure that it's clear that people understand, when you do want things and you need things, this is where you can go. That's where you can go. These are where the resources are to make things happen. So I just think it's a combination of everybody trying to work together, as I said, to achieve the common goal. Really, it's not going to happen. So.
Thank you, Mark. Have you got any ideas about how art how art is going to help?
It's interesting. I've had a crazy week. I did mention Ofsted at the start of this. It's been a crazy week already, and I didn't have a lot of time to think about this question in advance. And on the way here, I was looking at various friends of mine's comments that they'd put up on Facebook. A lot of them are poets, and one of them was talking about the impact of different pieces of art. So someone can write a book that can inspire you, or write a poem that seduces you to an idea. But at the end of the day, we do have to take, as individuals, a lot more responsibility for what's going on, and the solutions will be found through changes within individuals, even if those changes are about the setting up of organisations. For our young people, that will be a change, because a lot of these things that historically there were artistic movements, there were creative movements that were definitely a force for change. Today, poetry is quite often seen as being something which is about entertainment rather than opening the mind and thinking more. You're getting into competitive poetry, slamming and all that stuff, which is good for making poets able to reach a wider audience, but it's not necessarily making them think about big ideas. Rather they start to focus on being entertaining. So there is an issue that art stops being relevant to social change. And it's a big change. It's a big challenge to try and make art relevant and trying to make it part of a movement. But at the moment, I think we're only talking about the seeds of a movement, and perhaps it's about making where the biggest contribution that can be made at the moment is about making the connections and pointing out to people that we've seen some of these things before. Because a lot of the young people don't know who your mother was. There are a lot of the young people that don't know that you exist. There are a lot of young people that are unaware of our history and our culture, their own history and culture, wherever they may be from, because there are people there of colour and people of all sorts that were involved in the uprising, the riots, the different things. And I think we're right to say there were a lot of different things that took place in a very short space of time. They weren't all the same, and anybody who tells you they were all the same is talking nonsense. So particularly the man who said that described them all as just being pure criminality. Well, he's an idiot. But if you didn't know that, you're probably not going to agree on many things. There is, the hope that there should be a link between tax and expectation is something that's being seriously undermined right now. If you're a woman aged 58 at the moment, you may have paid national insurance for 40 or 50 years, and you're suddenly being told that your pension that you thought, which you paid into national insurance, you were told that this was going to provide for you in your old age, you will find that you're not going to get that pension. Instead of at 60, you're going to be getting it at 66. 58, they staggered it in. So if you're 58, you get a whole, I think it's 9 months. My mother is in this position. You get a whole 9 months difference from the people that are 20 years behind, because obviously that gives you a bit more time to prepare and make plans. So the idea that there is going to be a link, that I think a lot of us were brought up believing that there was a link between taxation and services, and I think what we're seeing, and that personally, I think that goes back to the post-Second World War period, the set-up of the welfare state, which I think are positive, and I think everybody should be investing in, and I think those are positive, is being completely undermined, and that the black and ethnic minority members of society just happen to be at the sharpest point in terms of feeling the cuts. So that's the reality, that the people at the bottom will always feel those worse. I haven't come up with many solutions. But if we're not making the connections and we're not aware of the history, there is no way we're going to find them.
This quick thing I'm going to share with you. Last year we were commemorating lots of 30th anniversaries. The New Cross Fire, and we put a blue plaque on the building, and there was a Black People's March, and we did 30 years since Brixton. And we had a particular kind of ceremony. In Brixton we created a civic square called Windrush Square that celebrates the fact that we've become contributors to society, and we're building the Black Cultural Archive National Heritage Centre as part of that square. And we filled that square with people. We had some rituals there where we acknowledged what had gone before and the struggles we'd had and the people who've passed. And we poured libation and we walked around the square and we blessed the site. And then in the afternoon, we had a thing inside Tate Library. And it was about trying to have a dialogue between the generations. And Linton Kwesi Johnson is one of our very important citizens. I grew up with him and he's friends of my family. But Linton's been suffering with cancer. And he got out of his sickbed to come and read his poem, The Great Insurrection, at this event. He came, he was very frail, he was thin as my finger. And he read his poem with great authority. And it galvanized the hundreds of people that were there that day. Such an extent that, in spite of his frailness, he read another poem. And it set up a dynamic, because the rest of the afternoon, instead of doing all the program we had planned to do, we had a dialogue between generations in poetry. And the power of the ideas and the words were immense. And it's created a momentum that's continued till now. We're doing all sorts of things. We're looking at, film festivals. We premiered History of Lovers Rock. Now, people wouldn't understand how that's political, but it was the first expression of indigenous cultural, for people of British origin, of African heritage. And Shabazz has created that. And women go particularly. And it's amazing when you see the atmosphere in the cinemas and places when they see their youth being represented on the screen. So we're giving all kinds of cultural and artistic expression a chance to interact with the community. So it's not just about working with people helping set up a business or organisation. It's about every element of how our society can operate. And you'll be amazed at how that inspires people and encourages people to get involved in positive activity. And if you can get to work with groups of young people around that atmosphere, around that environment, around those values and vibes, then things start to happen.
I'm aware that we're running out of time quite quickly, and I just want to spare a couple of minutes for the peeps if they want to have a final word. But before that, I know there's about 3 people who wanted to say something. Can you do it quite briefly?
Mine's really brief. It's just that the lady at the back.
Mike's coming.
Is it on? Hello. A lady at the back on the left somewhere was asking a question about gender and how that related to the rights. So I just wanted to pick back up on that and ask you if any of you thought anything about that. That's it.
Right. Okay. Yes. My friend here.
Moves faster when we work together. Many ends make light work.
Great suggestions today. Thank you. I think definitely we've heard about keeping the political thing going in terms of rights and equality. Definitely let's not undermine art, the sort of pride and developing that leadership context and own businesses, and that's still relevant, definitely. Because I think we need to become the leaders that it just, people have someone to look up to. I think also cleaning up the police, continually doing it. It has done a lot, but more, that's fair enough as well. But I think also, wouldn't it be good if we get to the position where, despite the inequality of police, if the police has killed somebody, then the inequality also of simple murder in the street, 2 children, and if it raises the same amount of frustration and outcry that very, very unjust act does for when 2 children do it to each other, wouldn't that be something? Because that's certainly, we're a long way from that now. That's my point.
I just want to say I like the suggestions that have come out. One thing I think is quite sad is that there's not actually police representation, so that obviously we've got to do something to try and combat this, but we need the support of there's LinkedIn at the back there, sorry. But my thing is, obviously we can try and hold these events to try and bring our people together and that, but we need to be allowed to do that. And a lot of times when we try and do these things, we get shut down. If you try and do a picnic in the park and stuff, you need to go through all these different warrants, and a lot of people don't have the time or the resources to be able to do that, so we need to be allowed to bring our people together to be able to come up with these solutions together.
Some final comments?
I want to say something really quickly, because you're absolutely right up there, bro, about the impact of the loss of life. And Pam Duggan has said this a lot of times. Had another gang, well, it was another gang in some sense, but had another gang killed her son. The pain that she felt would have been felt just as harsh. And sometimes we skirt over these conversations because people don't understand them. So let me try and say this really quickly. Right? White society doesn't understand anything about the impact of racism on black society and black communities. When we grew up and lived in the 70s and 80s, what they called racism, the impact of that racism, nobody has ever measured, nobody understands. You can mess up the life, the educational chances of one person in this room. So I'm a teacher, I don't like you, I mess up your educational charge. If all of you grew up in the same area, the same village, the same town, you can all support him. Regardless of the fact that I kicked him out of school when he was 12 because I just didn't like him. Okay? You can all support him. But the reality is if I remove a massive percentage of the people in this room, then no one's going to be able to support you later on. And that's what happened to us. We were excluded in our thousands. There's not no ones and twos, and we all came from the same community. Yeah. That's how we all started to crew up together, because we were all expelled from school together. So we all hung out together. We took some decisions back then when we were teenagers that were stupid decisions. We decided that what we wanted to do is stop society from hurting us. And since it was the institutions that was hurting us, we decided we wanted to make these institutions unnecessary in our lives. Mad decision. Only a 15 or 16-year-old who's probably puffing can make those can actually come to those kind of decisions. So we decided we was going to put a finger up to the police, to education, and we're now paying for those decisions. Right? We have to understand this as a community. This is the part about understanding about post-traumatic slavery syndrome. You get pushed till your back is against the wall. Sometimes you do some crazy things. You take your head and try to headbutt down the wall, and it's not going to work. And that's what we tried. And our kids are paying for some of the things that we did wrong a long time ago. Plus, there's all these different cultures that they're reacting to that is making them think that the only way that they can get any value, any props, any ratings on this place is by being the baddest person on the planet. And our community is beginning to understand that we can't be run by the bad man then, because that's running our community into a mad, sad situation. But it takes those who know better to get up and start to do better, and to get up and start to engage with young people. And I would say this to everybody in the room: the riots of August has given us all an opportunity to start re-engaging with young people, and should be giving us all an opportunity to try and help young people to understand where we're coming from. And again, we all have to take responsibility, because we don't have no Spike Lees here. We're not writing no books here. So there's nothing that youths can be born and be reading and learning. Because when we got to them and tell them how it used to be back in the day, it's like, okay, old man, okay, who wants to just hear words? When I was growing up, I didn't want to hear it, and those young people didn't want to hear it. So we got to lead by leadership, and we need to start that ASAP, to be quite honest. But sorry, one last thing: gender. Because if we don't mention gender, then especially an all-man panel. Okay, so the demonstration that went to Tottenham police station was led by women. It was led by women. Because we stayed there for about 5 hours, and most of those women had young children with them, the young women decided that they needed to remove themselves from that to go and look about their children. At the point that the young women started to leave, that's when the men got frustrated, because the men realized that the time for talking was done. And it was the men mainly who got in emotional states. Having said that, women participated on all different levels. I wish I brought Paula with me. She would surely tell you that she played a whole entire role. So women did get involved on different levels. The reason why the guys were the ones who actually got emotional is because normally when we're talking about those stop and searches and those interactions between police and community, it's normally with the guys. And that's why I think they definitely are the ones who are going to respond in the first instance. But I don't think that there was anything out there that was going to stop women from coming and participating should they want to do that. But I also believe as the mothers of the community, women were more able to hold themselves in check and not do the kind of things that the males thought they had to do, or felt compelled to do, or felt that they had no choice other but doing.
I know we're running over time, so if we can maybe just have some quick last comments. Thanks.
Quickly, on the gender side, there are a lot of things going on in the community. The whole thing about this public domain and young and groups, the males are visible, but young women are very much involved. And the women in my organisation have just put together a project to try and start to work with the young women around the whole question of violence. Because violence has been visiting a lot of these young women as a prize for them being involved in the groups and the gangs. And nobody's really addressing that properly. So women in my organisation have taken that initiative and are working with some of the institutions locally, start making contact, start working with them, building their confidence, and giving them other opportunities and getting involved in that pathological activity, because they've got to secure the generations for the future.